Geopolitics and Empire is joined by Nicholas Glinsman, CEO of EvoCapital, a macro specialist and commentator on geopolitics, politics, and history. Thank you for joining the podcast, Nicholas. I believe you're currently somewhere in Brazil. How are things in South America?
Well, it's interesting. Latin America is quite a bit behind Europe and the US in terms of vaccination. I just don't, it's very fun. Brazil itself, I'm finding a bit of a conundrum insofar as the central bank is raising rates aggressively and overshooting to quell inflation. But there's a bit of a fiscal crisis, and the bond market had a very severe adjustment last week. And I'm sort of at a loss to wonder what they're thinking. And then also, just generically in Latin America, the harder it gets for China to escape what I believe is, the typical emerging market middle income trap, the more Latin America, which has really sold itself to the Chinese, will suffer economically. So it's an interesting situation. And I say about the vaccinations with regard to Brazil. Brazil has an excellent system of vaccinating. So, a couple of years ago, there was a yellow fever scare. You just go to the local center, get your shot. Flu, get your shot, or they go around. Here, it's been a combination of not getting enough of Pfizer, Moderna, AstraZeneca, and there's no pushback against AstraZeneca, really. The pushback really occurred and should have occurred and rightly occurred with the Chinese vaccine, CoronaVac. The Chinese vaccines are, they're just, you might as well toss a coin. And unfortunately, I had my first AstraZeneca here, being British. I insisted that we were going to have the AstraZeneca. And also, I'm a little more comfortable with the vector, the old-fashioned vector method, as opposed to the new mRNA for the time being. And I follow very closely the advice of what people in the UK have been telling me, like, old colleagues, etc. But a couple of days after my first shot, having been really careful for the whole period, that was in May, my three boys got COVID, I got it, and I'm suffering rather like Lewis Hamilton, even though there's no real comparison between the two of us. So I have long COVID, and it manifests itself in me with, I suffered a severe depletion of my leg muscles. So I'm I got to the point, I look like I'm learning to walk again. So, it's been unpleasant. However, you have to keep your humor. That's the way it is. And, I think one of the solutions to this is going to be better therapeutics. The vaccines will progress ultimately. And I think I'm wondering whether the Delta variant is part of your typical process in a virus, in a pandemic, where the new variants become more contagious and less deadly. And I think we've seen that with a lot of the numbers. It was always going to be a case of vaccinated people were going to catch it again. But the great news there is the vaccines, all of them seem, of the three principal ones, seem to mitigate, the severity of the illness. So that's fine. So my only concern is being more of a Thatcherite in political bias. This control by the governments is just extraordinary. And what we are seeing, when you think that two of the best centers of rugby football, rugby union, Australia and New Zealand, and all my Australian and New Zealand friends are really tough cookies, to see how this government is nanny stating everything is just extraordinary. And it was very uncomfortable for a lot of my friends and family back in the UK when they were going through that. So I think, but there again, I always view that once governments have that amount of control, they ain't going to get rid of it. And we were talking about this off air just beforehand. That's why I just don't think the governments are going to let cryptocurrencies run wild. They're not going to lose. One, they don't want that as a challenge. Two, they don't want it to create any systemic risk. And, as we said off air earlier, 50 years ago, you had Nixon come off the gold standard, breaking the link with gold, breaking the restriction on gold. We're not in a world where we can corset the world's economic system anymore, which is what a supposedly restricted supply reserve asset would do. And I say supposedly in terms of crypto. Crypto is not restricted. You get a new coin all the time. So, that's a fallacy. So I suspect that, one, the central banks will do digital. Two, I'm wondering, I put in a suggestion to people close to the British project on the CBDC, that if you're going to go down that route, and I know full well that the Federal Reserve always looks at the research done by the Bank of England, they're pretty much twinned, especially when you think that there was an Englishman on the first board of the Federal Reserve, Paul Warburg. Mm-hmm. But I made the suggestion, given you've got onshore domestic US dollars and offshore what they call euro dollars, the offshore dollars, the Bank of England could easily create a CBDC in euro dollars, which would then be fungible with the US version when it comes. That would be very interesting, because if the bank did that, that would, I suspect it would be used by what I define as the Anglosphere, so the old Commonwealth. So, and that again would ensure that the US maintains the financial weapon of mass destruction, which is the US dollar reserve currency status, which it will anyway. But that would just enforce. I mean, I've got no, this idea. I suspect that the Chinese yuan has nefarious motives behind it anyway. I just, if people aren't taking renminbi right now on Belton Road, why are they going to use? Are the Chinese going to impose that? It's just the same as trying to impose payment in their domestic currency, which is not working. Belton Road contractors don't want renminbi; they usually want dollars. So sorry, that was a sidetrack right from the beginning. Right from the get-go.
No. This is actually good, because you're answering some of my last questions. First, I actually had a question about your thoughts on the authoritarian.
Well, I am in the southern hemisphere, so that would be logical.
Yeah. So I had the question about your thoughts on the authoritarian COVID government policies and protocols, which I think, a lot of people are seeing it, which is it's pretty crazy. I mean, they're restricting free speech, they're restricting freedom of movement, and all this sort of thing.
I think Sweden has a great model. They never closed down, never imposed mask mandates. Swedish society is somewhat different. I wouldn't trust British society to totally act. Youngsters don't act responsibly, so that's fine. But I've always felt that if you actually respect the population and educate them in a non-political, unbiased way, because science has always been political, by the way. You've always had groups of competing theorists. It's a very political discipline, science. So why would it be any different now? What really shocked me about the beginning of COVID was it wasn't just the UK government; it was the European governments. It was also the that was a ping, and it was also the US took so much weight of the Imperial College model under Dr. Neil Ferguson, not the historian. He's got it wrong since the get-go. Mad cow disease, every model he's ever done. It cost, I think, with the mad cow disease and the slaughter of the British bovine population, it cost the government about £10 million back a couple of decades ago. So, the reliance on someone, and the model never changed. That was the extraordinary thing. And I just, on the free speech side, where I'm so uncomfortable is I use social media, but I think you may have noticed what my group, the group that I'm involved with, Harold Malmgren, Albert Marco, Tony Nash, Tracy Schuhart, Giovanni Ponzetto, and a few others. What we focus on is these are the facts. If the facts are this, either this is the resolution or this is going to be the outcome. And without any political bias, when Biden won the election, if you just go back and look at Biden's record, One, he's arrogant. Two, he's always tried to impose his foreign policy view on everybody else. And three, to quote unquote Obama, you can rely on Joe to F up everything. One. Secondly, in terms of the last election in the UK, December 2019, which gave Boris Johnson a massive majority. What happened in the UK is the Labour Party swung way to the left. And Jeremy Corbyn actually does have a good relationship with Bernie Sanders. That tells you how far left Bernie is, by the way. Quasi-Marxist. His shadow chancellor of the Exchequer actually threw Mao's red book onto the centre in the House of Commons and said, perhaps you should read this. Okay. Now, there's a lot wrong with that. We can go through so many historical examples as to what would be bad about a lot of their policy. So I take that as an example. And so to equate Jeremy Corbyn and the Corbynistas as progressives. The terminology used in the States always befuddles me. Liberal is not meant to be very left-wing. It's more centrist, in the tradition of, say, the FDP in Germany, well, liberal free marketeers. So, but we'll just say very left-wing progressives. So after the election, where he got slaughtered, the Labour Party got slaughtered, Corbyn comes out and says, we may have lost the election, but we won the argument. Okay, now extrapolate that to the US situation. Biden was just a happy face to win the election. They just won the House. They just equated on the Senate. But the progressives are now about 90 in the House, and you're going to see policy there. Well, actually, I think what you're going to get is gridlock. I take the foreign policy debacle of Afghanistan, which was absolutely obvious the way it was done. And you knew it's clear he didn't listen to anybody, or he was listening to people who are just not very good. Okay, which he's having replaced all of the Pentagon generals and the heads with his own people. So he replaced efficient people who actually somewhat controlled the previous president with people that were just political cronies. Okay, so that's a disaster in the making. And if you take Austin in the Secretary of Defense, he was a logistics general, not a field general. So it gives you an idea. But if you take this debacle in the foreign policy, that now will weigh on domestic. If you're a moderate Democrat up for re-election next year, you're not going to tie yourself to Joe Biden, period. So I think what you have had happen over this last couple of weeks is that wall between the progressives and the moderate Democrats has got higher and higher. There's your border wall, right? So our view is that, in fact, and this will lead into the economics, it doesn't matter what the Senate's passed. Pelosi has tied the infrastructure bill bipartisan, which could pass the House on its own. She's tied that to the reconciliation bill, which I define as a social and green God's plan per the Soviets in the old day. And she's also tied it to the deficit. Well, okay. I don't see any of this being resolved by until late October at the earliest. So you have gridlock. So you're going to have a fiscal cliff coming into the rear view. You've got, today we had the PMIs in Europe and the US. One, they all surprised to the downside, some more than others. Two, the message has been consistent from the IHS market that supply shortages prevail, worker shortages prevail. It's consistent across Europe as well as the US. You've now got the Delta variant. We had several months, literally 3-4 months ago, said, watch how the Democrats will use COVID to impose a project fear, possibility of lockdowns in the winter. We got poo-pooed for that. Now look what's happening with the Delta variant. And so we don't think, for example, the Fed will do quantitative tightening. They'll talk about it. They could even start it. Who knows? They could start it. It's going to be reversed, and they'll be doing more QE. And I think that form of QE will be quite revolutionary, using more tools as are used in Japan. Remember, there's that Japanification of the US system. We're halfway there anyway. There's illiquidity in the US Treasury market because there's the Fed owns 65% of the 20 to 30-year bond sector. So if you have that Japanification, and the Japanese have often been leaders of revolutionary monetary policy. So back in the 30s, I think it was Tokishida. I'm not going to hang my hat on the name. He had been finance minister. He was from a noble family. He became Bank of Japan governor, was doing QE there, then got assassinated by the generals when he wanted to stop. Anyway, so the Japanification. So what have the Japanese done? They've done, you have days where you don't see the Japanese government bond market register a trade. So there's something. You have yield curve control. You have de facto money, MMT. I personally think you have MMT in Europe already, particularly for countries like Italy. The ECB's bought everything they've done. So I think that the next round, because each time you have to do something for an emergency level, you have to go bigger. Having done big, you've got to go bigger now. So I think we could have all sorts of additional Japan-style techniques in the QE. I think we get to a level of MMT where the Fed is financing the deficit. Our view had always been that a crisis would be manufactured to create a sharp downswing in the US stock markets. Now, bear this in mind, with Robin Hood, etc., there's always been a positive correlation between the stock market and the economy in the US. Every time there's a slump, CEOs whose pay is linked to stock price performance oftentimes cut costs, cut workers. So there is that. Now with the Robin Hood and the online use of stimulus checks to participate in things like meme stocks and so on and so forth, that link is greater. Okay? So it just strikes me that they're going to end. I still don't think they'll get to the point of QE. I think there was a bit of a tell, which nobody's talking about, but a couple of people whom I respect a lot. I think it was initial tell when Jackson Hole, which is this week, was turned into another virtual meeting. Well, you don't announce tapering at a virtual meeting, right? The other thing that I've been focused on is how people don't listen to Jerome Powell. He's been focused on Black and Hispanic unemployment. Now, yes, it improved last month, but everything improved. It was a stellar set of numbers. But why would the Fed, given their de facto third mandate, why would the Fed settle at 8 or 7.5% Black Hispanic unemployment when the generic number is down at 5, for example? Is that an acceptable differential? No, obviously not. So I'm doubtful they'll get to the point where they can execute. They'll talk about it as much as they want until that stock market crisis is manufactured. Okay, and we're not ready yet. We needed Congress to come back. And I think really first couple of weeks of September, the month of September is a good time to start being very anxious about the stock market for, say, a 20% correction in the S&P. And the correction will be swift. We're in a world that everything moves much quicker than it used to, including news, of course. Now, if they revert from quantitative tightening to quantitative easing, the journey there, I suspect, we have that correction. So you want to be out of the stock market. You want to be in the dollar. I think the dollar can go up another 3 to 5% in that correction phase. You don't want to be in commodities. But as we've come to the bottom and we see that the Fed is shifting towards, we can't let this happen, there's not going to be any fiscal, we don't think the big deal gets done at all. That's just not going to happen. And then you worry about what Nancy Pelosi does, because if you recall, she played election on a big fiscal package that was agreed. She played election with it, and it didn't pass anyway. That doesn't happen, so it becomes clear that the Fed has to step in place, which is pushing on a string, to be honest with you. On that basis, you go back to the same trades that worked back in April, May last year, which is exactly what we're setting out. I would say that regardless of the correction that's impending, in our view, over the next 2-3 years, you will see commodity prices at much higher levels. And the rationale for that is we've got used to China being the dependent marginal extra demand on commodities. Now, if we're looking at China slowing down and China having middle income problems, and clearly something negative is going on because of the way she's behaving. I wish people would stop messaging me whilst I'm talking to you. Anyway, that's the ping, and that's what shaking, moving the. Anyway, so back to China. Even if you take out that marginal extra demand, they've got a basic demand that they need, and they can't produce it. There's food shortages there for sure. It gets replaced by green, renewable. Now, pretty much we're going to have the same end result, if not even a higher demand for some of the stuff that, copper, aluminium, so on and so forth. Even if you think of crude oil, between now and getting to where they want us to get, if we get back to a normalized world where we're all flying again, just that increase in demand from global airlines for jet fuel could send crude oil significantly higher. My target is actually $100, but I think we can go well north, like we did in 2008. Now, the reason this time, though, it's not just assume demand's stable because we've replaced the marginal in China with ESG. It's supply. We're in a different paradigm. People have been used to demand driving everything, plus technology. This time, though, it's supply, because there's no capex in industrial metals. There's no capex in fossil fuels. There's no capex in nuclear. For some reason, nuclear is not in anymore, even though that is the answer to everybody's renewable energy direction and directive. So we're not getting supply, and demand is going to stay at a high level. Okay, so that's inflationary. So I think we are going to find ourselves, and also pre-COVID, global economy was beginning to slow down. I think we end up in a stagflationary world. And you've got central banks in the black hole of monetary policy. It's not a good place.
Yeah, I had a question about that. I've had guests that generally agree with your assessment, and then I have others, and as well as other people that I read that perhaps have a more alarmist take, where they talk about this hyperinflation crack-up boom that's imminent. And I've talked to people who have been talking about this for like 10 or 20 years, and we haven't seen it yet. What are your thoughts on?
For the US dollar country, the country of the reserve currency, you can't have hyperinflation. No, it's not possible. Okay. Other places, well, I think third world, absolutely can get hyperinflation, because the worst. Now, if we get this massive easing by the US, we've had the dollar go up in a risk-off environment. The dollar will then come back down. I'm sort of thinking we come back. So I'm using the dollar in US dollar basket, the DXY, Dixie. So we're currently at 93 even, and that's with a fall off of 0.5% today. We had up until recently said dollar stays 88.92 at max 93. Now, between now and the next whack of QE, or monetary policy easing by the Fed, that risk-off crisis will likely push the dollar to somewhere around 97. We could well overshoot and get much higher, of course. It depends what how people fight it. Then when we get the QE, everybody's said, well, if there's more QE, the dollar's value is going to collapse. I'm just sitting here sort of thinking, actually, we could get back to 88, 92. Just sit there. Because I think there's a lot of emotion involved in everything as well. So I just think it would be negative for the dollar as an immediate reaction, but people forget everything is relative. So if the US is having to do that, what the hell's Europe going to do with a central bank that is not your typical bag-hot central bank? It is not your lender of last resort. Even though it's very political and politically aligned to Brussels, I think you're going to have Birkin pushback for more sovereignty by the countries. There's no doubt in my mind. They'll try and stop it, but their own COVID debacle, which was the vaccines, you see, there's not a lot of press about it. There still isn't a lot of press about it at the moment, but their cock up at the beginning on the vaccines, which was a complete display of incompetence by Brussels. Actually, you could probably quantify how many people it killed. That's not a great political message. That will be a message used under each election after the German. In terms of, so there's that. Then there's a political unrest saying France has got an election next year. There's the French love to demonstrate, and they love what they view as their constitutional right to liberty, which Macron is just throwing down all the time. That's going to be quite a noisy affair. And I think as we get back after this month, when the French get back to work after their holidays, we've had big demonstrations in Paris, and this is the holiday season. You wait till everybody's back. And it's not a fringe group demonstrating either. It's everybody. Friends of mine have been in that demonstration. It's old, young, right, left. Extraordinary mix of people in those demonstrations. And I think likewise you've seen it in Holland. I think the Italians, they've had demonstrations, particularly in the north, which you would sort of expect be similar to the French. South has not been so demonstrable. So I think there's you've got governments that don't want to give back freedom. You've got the virus and a lot of misinformation. You've got a global economy that looks like it's going to revert back to the pre-COVID situation. You've got the wealthy that have done extremely well out of COVID. I'm just not convinced things are that good right now. And I'm an optimist. This is my optimistic take. But at the same time, if you're involved in the financial markets, the good thing is macro is back, but you have to, typically macro starts with interest rates. Well, less so this time. If you want to have the reflation trade, maybe you don't go short treasury market, but you go long commodities. That's a reflation trade. Or even better still, you go long companies that do the commodities because you get a higher beta, a better performance. So that's sort of my view of the globe. You've also got these lunatic situations going back to Australia and New Zealand. They're locked. How self-destructive is that? I never understood this argument of complete lockdowns as opposed to take care of the vulnerable people at all costs first and let everybody be very responsible. But you can't kill an economy. There's going to be a cost-benefit analysis by some academics at some point that show that the cost-benefit of lockdown, well, there's been very little benefit, but huge cost. The cost-benefit of unemployment, that's an unhealthy situation. Closed businesses, people who've died or who've not had their corrective surgery because the hospitals have been locked down. I just found this whole thing really very confusing in the extreme. Mm-hmm. And I know quite a few politicos, and they're very rational people, and some of them just bought into this. And I found that very worrying, actually. That's the worst to come out of this. And now we're seeing, a situation where the leader of the free world probably is not in control of everything he's doing, to be honest with you. I always thought when he won the election, there's a Politburo of 5 people controlling policy there. And it's not him.
Yeah, I wanted to go back to the U.S. and just get your thought again. We have the midterms, I think, next year. Do you see any we're talking about the economy and economic crisis. You see any great political crisis coming forward? And as well, you mentioned Afghanistan, and we're starting to see articles being published now talking about the fall of U.S. empire. Do you see this big blow now to the prestige and status of the U.S. politically? And do you see any kind of, people talk about civil war and stuff. I mean, some form of it. Do you see in the years ahead any huge political crisis situation?
No, because I don't think China steps into the void, and Russia is too small and insignificant in that respect. Yes, they can cause trouble in certain hotspots, but I think what you've seen. Let me give you an example of the Chinese. So they work very closely, in inverted commas, with the Pakistanis. If you go and look at the press and dig, you will find there's been riots. Where that bomb exploded in Pakistan was in the port region of Gwandar. Well, this was meant to be developed by the Chinese. The Chinese are there. And so the Chinese fisheries. And that's where all the trouble started. So that's where you got pushback. And it's the regional liberation army that's now attacking the Chinese. I think people over expect from the Chinese. Taiwan, if they were going to attack Taiwan, they would have done it already. She cannot afford a military escapade like Taiwan, because he knows full well that the Taiwanese will give them a really bloody nose, the attacking forces. You're not talking Hong Kong. You're talking going into an island of 24, 25 million people. And you're talking about going into the island with violence. And I think most of the population rises up against that. So, but, just that process of landing, one, that's going to be very bloody for the PLA. Secondly, the other thing that people forget about that area is the next island chain above Taiwan are the Japanese, who have a navy that the numbers are smaller than the Chinese, but, infinitely more effective, powerful navy than the Chinese. Chinese have the numbers, but a couple of months ago, a Japanese coastal guard, it wasn't even one of their major ships, forced a Chinese submarine to surface. It was near the Senkaku Islands. So people overestimate the ability of the Chinese in that respect. Why haven't they done it already? This is the question, right? Why not do it now with what's going on in Afghanistan? No, they're not doing it. So I think that's the reason. I think she's under a lot of pressure. And he has a lot of enemies, clearly. That's why you've now got what I've termed as universal basic income with Chinese characteristics, right? Prosperity to be shared, but the wealthy will be left with very little except for either four walls or, a memorial from their family. So I think people just overestimate the ability of the Chinese. Africa is going to be interesting, but what's interesting about Africa, which is where the Chinese and the Russians are quite active at the moment and intend to be more active, is these countries have historical ties to the ex-colonialists. Now, that may not be a popular word in the US, but actually it still means stuff in Africa. So a very simple example in the past is several years ago, the government of Sierra Leone requested military help from the British to calm down the civil unrest, and it worked peacefully. Okay? So on that basis, there's a lot of leverage to be had from the British, the British and the French in particular. And I think you'll see, Kenya, there's been some interesting announcements made by the British and the Kenyans recently in cooperation. So I think there's enough of a pushback. I don't think it's a free ride for the Chinese under any sense of the word. I also, let me throw out another contrarian view. Someone I have huge respect with, Valina, came up with the term dragon bear. Okay? I'm not convinced anymore. It's worked very well, but The Chinese are exploiting Siberian forests, much to the chagrin of the local Russians in that part of Russia. When Vladivostok celebrated its centenary, there was a very nasty message from the Chinese to the Russians. That's not yours, that's ours. You took it from us. And I think my thought process is actually Afghanistan will not be a route for further close work between them, because that's right in Russia's backyard. By the way, talking of Afghanistan and China, we had no military casualties for 18 months on the US side. I think somewhat longer for the British. You had this huge military intel center on the Chinese border, and you just said, phew. But China is your biggest systemic rival. And you get, and it really wasn't a forever war, because it had been quiet. It wasn't, you can't blame the Afghan military because they lost on Biden's announcement, they lost air support, they lost the contractors that maintained their own air force, so they couldn't even replace it. And the army had been trained according to the US model. Okay. So, but the strategies, Biden puts a lot of weight in his foreign policy experience, and that doesn't seem like it was really thought out too well. If China is the big rival and you have that center there, and if you really wanted to create a little bit of internal turbulence, and they're not this is not something that they wouldn't do because they've done it in the past, you help the Uyghurs surreptitiously. So a lot of it just doesn't make sense. Unfortunately, I'm not bullish on our current crop of political leaders in most places.
That reminds me of, I think it was the U.S. NATO who bombed Chinese embassy in Belgrade back in the 90s. And you're right. Yeah, I very much like Galina Chaparova's work. I had a question. Speaking of China, one of your other colleagues you mentioned, Tony Nash, whose work I really enjoy as well. He mentioned on Twitter, I think, I'm not sure how serious he was, that Belton Road is basically dead. So a lot of people...
Very serious. Mm-hmm. Very serious. And again, that opens the door to the ones that are really pushing back against this practically, because the US hasn't been, or was beginning to, and then we had the Biden administration come in. But the Japanese are offering alternatives to Belt and Road financing. And they're also, where the US was helping, I don't know whether it's continued, but the US, UK, and Japan were providing legal help so that sovereign nations could find ways out of the Japanese debt if it were paid. One of the things you've seen with, is it Ethiopia? I think it's Ethiopia. And I could be wrong, so I won't be held to that. Is it Ethiopia? Maybe. Where they were meeting with the Paris Club. It could actually even be Argentina. Or one of the South American countries. Anyway, one of the most indebted third world countries was trying to have IMF debt rescheduled as well as, and the Chinese would not engage with the Paris Club. So people are that, some countries have embraced what the Japanese have done. The other thing I would say is that, if you look at Sri Lanka and you look at where they basically indebted themselves and the collateral of the port, which is in quite a nice strategic part of the world. People say, well, that port's gone to China. They forget the idea of nationalization. You get a different regime there, nationalize. What, the Chinese are going to attack you as a country? I'm not sure that's likely to happen, given the proximity to India and the support that the Sri Lankans would get. This is why the Chinese are so worried. One, that on the border, it's all about water, these clashes. But the Chinese are worried about the Indians. And that's why, and if you really want to take that to the next level, that's why they're terrified of the Quad. You've got a very capable military that will only get stronger in Japan. you've got Australia, you've got India, and you've got the US. They should be worried.
Do you feel any potential for serious conflict of any sort in the near future between some of these big powers?
No. The Russians do proxy for the most part. And the Chinese, no, I don't think so. I don't think so. I just don't think the Chinese would dare. If the Chinese did something that really had an impact on the US, you hit them with the ultimate weapon, which is the dollar.
And speaking of that, I want to go back to the beginning, what you mentioned about these central bank digital currencies. You mentioned like the Britcoin, I think what they're calling it, and then the Fed coin or whatever. What if that all went through? People talk about this kind of Chinese style social credit system coming to the US. I mean, well, what would that mean for our freedoms?
Look, you've already got it in New York, social credit system. You got the mandatory vaccine pass. That's a social credit system. It's already there. So it would all unify under something, I suggest. But the vaccine passports, this is one thing I said right at the beginning of the crisis. We're going to end up with vaccine passports. So you have to get, if you want to travel, you're going to need, or social, you're going to need a vaccine passport. I've already got mine. I'm here in Brazil. I've got my certificate, but I put all the details on. I typically use American Airlines, and there's a system they use. It's all there. And, if I want to travel, not that I'm physically able to travel right now, it'd be a bit too embarrassing, to be honest with you. I'd have to be on roller skates. That's how I get it. You know what? That's what I should do. Hit the roller skates. But no, I think we're already on the path, aren't we? The vaccine passports, that is literally a social credit system.
Right. But going further, though, beyond the vaccine, do you see it then evolving like to the point where, if you have wrongthink, right, that they can potentially turn off your bank account or punish you somehow?
Let me put it to you this way. Okay, here's an actual example of social credit with the banks. You've heard of OnlyFans, the website in the UK?
Mm-hmm.
Now no longer allowing the more risque videos. Well, that was the banks telling them to stop it. Otherwise, you can't bank with us. And they need the banks because it's all digitalized payments, not digital. We've already got digital. You got your cards in your iPhone, that's a digital transaction. Takes seconds. So yeah, I do. I mean, I think it's already happening, isn't it? I think OnlyFans is your perfect example. It was pressure from the banks. You don't do so, and that's the other thing on the cryptos. In Europe, the banks are not taking proceeds from crypto sales. Once the US has sorted out who's got what responsibility, that's when you're going to see the legislation. And ultimately, it will end up with know your client, KYC, AML documentation, and the killer form, 1099, the IRS form. Yes. And there you go. And that will push it all offshore. So it has to, it has to be regulated. It absolutely has to be regulated. If it's not regulated, what's the point? It's a scam for criminals. It's pure and simple. By the way, I still suspect the narco gangs prefer dollar cash than crypto.
It's probably safer, and I think they're saying now, U.S. government can, if they wanted to, forensically track crypto accounts.
Of course they can.
So, yeah.
I mean, the presumptions that they can't is ridiculous. But they're also trying to get rid of cash. The governments. I mean, in Europe, you can only deposit a certain amount of cash. You can only withdraw a certain amount of cash. So this drive away from cash is all part of what could easily be a social credit system. My biggest concern is that the social media companies have way too much power without giving explanation. And where you see this most, and I have no opinion, I do have an opinion, but I never express it, is those people that get kicked off social media in terms of the transgender discussion. You see people 10, 15, 20 years ago who fought for women's rights, fought against women's violence towards women, and because they have a certain view, they then get kicked off social media. These are heroes or heroines, and they get kicked off social media. We should have, with certain exceptions, of course, complete free speech, each to their own, and you can discuss it. What we have instead is a small minority group on social media that has way more power in an anonymous fashion. And that power is then accentuated by those that control social media. And, you get ridiculous stuff.
Mm-hmm. We've pretty much covered the waterfront. You've talked about Africa, EU, US, China. I guess one of my last questions would be, what would be just some rules of thumb, general recommendations for people in terms of generating wealth or protecting wealth,
well,
going forward?
I think we're on the verge of another screech higher in risk assets. Risk assets, I mean stocks, particularly the US, and commodities. Okay? I think the dollar will move higher, but we're not quite ready there. And this time frame is quite short in the investment cycle. You're talking the next couple of months until we get to a 20% correction in the S&P 500. It'll be more in the small cap Russell index. It may be slightly less or equivalent in the NASDAQ 100. Once that comes, that the Fed will shift very quickly. And if you combine that with the lack of the big fiscal, and maybe a lack of all fiscal, once that occurs, just change your positioning from having protected your portfolios or got out of risk assets and just dive into what worked April, May last year. And that would be the mega caps. They'll probably take the small caps with it, but it's the commodity trade. This is the big one. And I mentioned energy and industrial metals. Less sensitive to dollar direction and less sensitive to risk because it's not widely held. It'll be agriculturals. I think, if you go and buy fertilizer companies, I've got some companies I'd be flying back into, right, on a decent sized correction. We've made a lot of money. I've even made money in a company called Peabody Energy, which is coal. We put out a recommendation mid-December. I think the price was $1.82. This was a really big market cap. It was $1.82, and right now it's $13.87. That's better than Bitcoin. There you go, right? It's better than in that respect, that's better than Bitcoin. And I've got a company at the end of it. But the two companies that we focus on well and did really well of the main companies that you'd look at, which became cheap and thus almost mid-sized, was Mosaic, but any of the fertilizers. CF Industries is another one. And the UK company, it does have an ADR, Glencore. What's interesting about Glencore is even when crude oil went negative, Glencore was making a fortune. It does metals, it does rare earths, it's getting rid of its coal, but it trades energy. Okay, it originally came out of Mark Rich's effort in Zug. It's also a British quoted company, which means that if we get that QE as we anticipate, it shocks people by what they're going to try and do, and the dollar were to come off, you're then long sterling. It's a nice trade, because implicit in a foreign ADR is a 50% is in the currency, effectively. So you're long Glencore, a major commodity player, and you would also be long half that position's got an equivalent attachment to sterling. I would also say that if you buy into what we're saying, so iron ore producers, well, there's the two big Australians or three big Australians, and then there's the big Brazilian. I wouldn't touch the Brazilian. I think because of what's going on with China, I'd prefer to be long the Australians. So same trades, just I think just going to be patient. It's going to go like this, and then it's going to go like from here down, much higher. Okay, but commodities for the next couple of years, I think, are the big macro trade. And it doesn't matter whether the economy is booming. It's supply paradigm. The suppliers, there's not the capex. The companies aren't making the investments. They did all beforehand for China. It killed them in 2008. And they haven't done so since.
All right. I think we'll leave it there. You're on Twitter at @Glinsman, and where you provide excellent commentary. And I think your website is intelligencequarterly.com.
Intelligencequarterly.com, which is actually going through a major development upgrade over the next 6-8 weeks, where our clients already get stuff, but we'll be offering more accessible subscription services.
Is there any other website or project we should know about?
No, that's it for the time being. I mean, we are being approached to actually run money because what we've actually, I've got track records, but I can't publish them. But what we've done in the last year is make them publicly available. So we actually do have an audit trail, and it's worked very well. So, Albert puts out stuff, I put out stuff. Albert is at AmLivemon, AmLivemon. He makes his view very well known, does Albert. So we combine that, and we're bringing together a really interesting group. So more of that as we move ahead. You'll see various announcements.
All right. Yeah, I think I follow his work on Twitter as well. So, all right, for a big picture view of what's going on in the world, economy, politics, geopolitics, be sure to follow Nicholas Glinsman. Thank you, Nicholas, for being on Geopolitics and Empire.
My pleasure. Anytime.
I hope you enjoyed this Geopolitics and Empire podcast interview. The website is geopoliticsandempire.com, and I encourage you to sign up for the free email list through which you can receive an update of every new podcast, as well as a long list of key news headlines once a week. We're being heavily censored. YouTube has deleted some of our videos, and we currently have one strike. Patreon has terminated our account. Facebook has restricted our page, and Reddit has been deleting posts. Our favorite social media channels are Telegram and Twitter. The best places to watch the podcast beyond YouTube are on Odyssey, BitChute, and Brighteon. The best places to listen to the podcast are on SoundCloud, Apple, Spotify, Google, or on any other podcast app. To help keep this podcast alive, leave a review on Apple Podcasts and wherever else. Subscribe to all our platforms and leave a donation if possible via Subscribestar, PayPal, Bitcoin, or Ethereum. You can also find us on MeWe, Minds, Gab, Float, VK, LinkedIn, and Instagram. Thanks for listening.